On the night of October 25th, 1760, the bells of London began to toll. Across the city, messengers rode through darkened streets carrying a single, world-changing announcement. King George II was dead. Britain, an empire stretching across continents, had a new monarch. But the young man who now wore the crown was not a hardened general, nor a seasoned politician. He was only 22 years old. His name was George, and in the decades that followed, this quiet, dutiful king would face storms no British monarch had ever endured. Revolution in America, war across Europe, political rebellion at home, personal illness that shook the throne itself. To his critics, he would become a tyrant who lost an empire. To his supporters, he remained a king who never abandoned his duty. But who was George III, really? Was he the stubborn monarch blamed for the American Revolution? The steady king who guided Britain through the age of upheaval? Or a tragic ruler whose mind collapsed under the weight of an empire? To understand George III, we must return to the beginning. Long before revolution, long before war, when a shy boy was being raised for a destiny no one expected. Because George III did not grow up preparing to rule Britain. At first, he was never supposed to be king at all. George was born on June 4th, 1738, at Norfolk House in London. He was the grandson of King George II, ruler of Great Britain and Hanover. But George was not first in line to the throne. That honor belonged to his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales. Frederick was energetic, popular with the public, and deeply disliked by his own father. The royal court was divided between factions loyal to the king and those who supported the prince. Into this tense family world, young George was raised. From an early age, he was quiet, serious, and unusually disciplined for a child of royalty. Tutors educated him in mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and history. Unlike many aristocrats of the time, he developed a lifelong interest in science and learning. George became the first British monarch to receive a systematic education in the sciences. He studied under John Stuart, the Earl of Bute, a Scottish nobleman who would become one of the most influential figures in his life. But tragedy arrived early. In March 1751, Prince Frederick died suddenly at the age of 44. A burst lung, according to contemporary reports. The death shocked Britain. Overnight, 13-year-old George became heir to the British throne. His mother, Princess Augusta, understood the stakes immediately. Britain was a powerful empire, but its politics were chaotic. Kings depended heavily on Parliament, and ministers competed constantly for influence. Augusta feared that politicians might manipulate her son, so she gave him a simple instruction that George would remember for the rest of his life. George, she told him, be a king. The phrase became a guiding principle. Not a tyrant, not a puppet. A king who ruled with dignity and responsibility. As George matured, he developed a reputation for honesty and restraint. Unlike earlier Hanoverian monarchs, he spoke fluent English and identified deeply with Britain rather than Germany. When he finally ascended the throne in 1760, he addressed Parliament with a declaration that captured public attention. Born and educated in this country, he said, "I glory in the name of Britain." For many citizens, this was refreshing. Previous kings from the Hanoverian dynasty had often seemed distant or foreign. George III presented himself differently. He was young, British, and committed to duty. But the world he inherited was already on the edge of transformation. At the moment George became king, Britain was fighting a global conflict known today as the 7 Years' War. The war had begun in 1756 and stretched across Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean. Historians often describe it as the first true world war. In North America, British forces battled France for control of vast territories. And for Britain, victory was within reach. Under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, British armies and navies achieved remarkable successes. Quebec fell in 1759. French power in Canada collapsed. By the time the war ended in 1763, Britain had gained enormous new lands in North America and India. The British Empire had never been larger, but victory came with a dangerous cost. War had left Britain buried under enormous debt. Government officials faced a difficult question. Who would pay for the defense of these newly conquered territories? Many British politicians believed the answer was obvious: the American colonies. For more than a century, Britain's North American colonies had enjoyed relative autonomy. Colonial assemblies collected local taxes and governed their communities with little interference. But after 1763, London began tightening control. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The law required colonists to pay taxes on printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even pamphlets. For British officials, the measure seemed reasonable. After all, the war had been fought partly to defend the colonies. But in America, the reaction was explosive. Colonists argued that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. Protests erupted in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Crowds burned tax stamps. Effigies of British officials were hung in the streets. A new slogan spread rapidly through colonial newspapers: "No taxation without representation." George III watched these developments with concern. Despite later accusations, the king did not personally design most colonial policies. Decisions came from Parliament and government ministers. But as monarch, he supported Parliament's authority, and he believed firmly that rebellion against lawful government could not be tolerated. The tension continued to grow. In 1770, British soldiers fired on a crowd in Boston during a confrontation, later known as the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed. Though the event was small in scale, colonial leaders used it as powerful propaganda. Then came 1773. Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies. The law lowered the price of tea, but maintained a tax. To many colonists, the issue was no longer the price. It was the principle. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of American protesters boarded ships in Boston Harbor disguised as Mohawk Indians. They threw 342 chests of British tea into the freezing water. The Boston Tea Party had begun. In London, the reaction was swift and furious. Parliament passed the coercive acts, what Americans would soon call the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts lost much of its self-government. Instead of calming tensions, the measures pushed the colonies closer together. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. War was no longer unthinkable. By April 1775, the crisis erupted into violence. British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts to seize colonial weapons stores. Militia forces confronted them. Shots rang out. No one knows who fired first. But by the end of that day, the American Revolutionary War had begun. For George III, rebellion in the colonies represented more than a political disagreement. It was a direct challenge to British authority. In October 1775, the king addressed Parliament with blunt words. "The colonies," he declared, "are in open and avowed rebellion." From that moment, Britain prepared for full war. The conflict quickly grew, far more complex than British leaders expected. At first, Britain possessed enormous advantages. The British Army was professional and experienced. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. The colonies lacked centralized government and struggled to supply their forces. Yet geography proved a formidable obstacle. North America was vast. Supplying armies across the Atlantic was slow and costly. Communication between London and commanders in America could take weeks. Meanwhile, colonial forces under General George Washington learned to adapt. They avoided large battles when possible. They relied on local support, and gradually, they built an army capable of resistance. Then came a turning point. In October 1777, British General John Burgoyne surrendered his army at Saratoga in New York. The defeat shocked Britain, but more importantly, it convinced France to enter the war on the American side. Now Britain faced not only colonial rebels, but also one of Europe's most powerful military rivals. Soon Spain and the Dutch Republic joined the conflict against Britain as well. The American War had become global, Across oceans and continents, British forces fought to defend their empire. Despite setbacks, George III remained determined. Many politicians began arguing for peace with the colonies. But the king believed surrender would weaken Britain's authority everywhere. If one part of the empire could rebel successfully, others might follow. For years, the war dragged on. Battles raged across the American countryside. British armies captured cities but struggled to control territory. Then, in 1781, another decisive moment arrived. At Yorktown, Virginia, a British army under General Charles Cornwallis found itself trapped by American and French forces. French warships blocked escape by sea. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. When news reached London, the political consequences were immediate. The government collapsed. Parliament demanded negotiations. George III reportedly reacted with visible distress. According to some accounts, he even considered abdication. But instead, he remained on the throne. In 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The American colonies were gone. For many critics, George III became the symbol of that loss. Yet the king did not withdraw from public life. In fact, the years after the American Revolution would reveal another side of his reign, one defined by stability, reform, and national resilience. By the late 1780s, Britain began recovering economically. Trade expanded rapidly with new markets across the globe. Ironically, commerce with the United States soon resumed and flourished. George III also became known for his personal morality and family life. Unlike many earlier monarchs, he avoided extravagant mistresses and scandalous affairs. He married Queen Charlotte in 1761 and remained devoted to her throughout their lives. Together, they had 15 children. At court, the royal family projected an image of domestic stability that appealed strongly to the British public. George developed a passion for agriculture and rural life. At his estate in Windsor, he experimented with farming techniques and livestock breeding. Some observers jokingly called him Farmer George. But beneath this calm image, new storms were gathering. Across the English Channel, revolutionary ideas were spreading through France. In 1789, the French Revolution began. The ancient monarchy of Louis XVI faced growing unrest. Crowds stormed the Bastille prison in Paris. Within a few years, France would execute its king and declare a republic. For Britain, the revolution presented both a threat and a warning. Political reformers in Britain initially sympathized with French calls for liberty. But as violence intensified in France, public opinion shifted. In 1793, Britain entered war against revolutionary France. This conflict would last more than 2 decades. And during those years, George III faced a deeply personal crisis. In 1788, the king began experiencing alarming symptoms. He spoke rapidly and uncontrollably. He suffered confusion, agitation, and insomnia. At times, he appeared detached from reality. Doctors struggled to understand the illness. Some believed it was a mental breakdown. Others suspected physical disease. Modern historians have debated the causes for centuries, with theories ranging from bipolar disorder to a genetic condition called porphyria. Whatever the cause, the episode terrified the royal court. For months, George was unable to rule effectively. Parliament debated whether his son, the Prince of Wales, should become regent. Then, unexpectedly, the king recovered. By early 1789, George III returned to public duties. Crowds celebrated his recovery across Britain. But the illness would return later in his life, and the shadow of that uncertainty never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, the war against France intensified. In 1799, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France. Within a few years, Napoleon would dominate much of Europe. British forces fought him across the continent and at sea. The most famous naval victory came in 1805. At the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets. The triumph secured Britain's control of the oceans. Yet victory came with tragedy. Nelson himself was killed during the battle. The war continued. Napoleon conquered vast territories across Europe, but Britain remained defiant. Its navy protected the island nation, while alliances formed and collapsed across the continent. Throughout these years, George III remained a symbol of national endurance. But by 1810, his health declined dramatically. Another severe episode of mental illness struck. This time, the king never recovered. Blind, frail, and unable to govern, George III withdrew completely from public life. In 1811, Parliament formally established the regency. His son, the Prince of Wales, ruled as Prince Regent. George III would spend his final years secluded at Windsor Castle, unaware of many events unfolding beyond its walls. Yet history continued moving. In 1815, Napoleon suffered final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Britain emerged as one of the most powerful nations in the world. The empire George III had once feared losing entirely was stronger than ever. But the king, who had endured revolutions, wars, and personal suffering, did not live to see that triumph clearly. George III died on January 29, 1820, at the age of 81. He had reigned for nearly 60 years, one of the longest reigns in British history. His legacy remains complex. In the United States, he is often remembered as the monarch opposed by the American Revolution. But in Britain, historians frequently see a different picture. George III was not a tyrant in the absolute sense. Britain during his reign remained governed by parliament and law. Instead, he was a constitutional monarch, navigating one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. Empires rose and fell during his lifetime. Revolutions reshaped politics across continents. And through it all, George III believed deeply in one principle above all others: duty. He once wrote that a king must always place the interests of the nation above his own comfort. Whether admired or criticized, George III attempted to live by that belief. His reign witnessed the birth of the United States, the terror of the French Revolution, and the defeat of Napoleon. Few rulers have faced such sweeping transformations, and fewer still have endured them for so long. Today, historians continue debating his decisions and character. Was he too stubborn in dealing with the American colonies? Perhaps. Did he help stabilize Britain during an era of revolution? Many believe so. But beyond politics and war, George III's life reveals something deeply human. A young man unexpectedly crowned. A ruler struggling to protect an empire. A father, husband, and scholar battling illness while carrying the weight of a throne. In the end, George III's story is not simply about losing America. It is about ruling during an age when the world itself was changing, and about a king who tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to meet the demands of history with steadfast resolve.